Ms. Kristy Beharry, and she will be speaking on late embryonic mortality identified by ultrasonography on 4 dairy farms.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As mentioned before, my name is Kristy Beharry, and I'm also a final year student completing my BSc in Animal Science. Today, I'll be presenting on a preliminary investigation of the prevalence of late embryonic mortality in dairy cattle on selected farms in Trinidad. So, as we all know, a lot of emphasis is being put on improving the agricultural sector in Trinidad and Tobago, whether it be by improving our crop production or livestock production. Taking this into consideration, the dairy industry has not been left out. A lot of work is going into improving the industry. However, it is difficult to improve the dairy industry since many factors affect dairy production. At the top of our head, I'm sure all of us can call out factors that affect animal production in Trinidad, whether it be the availability of land or feed costs. Currently too, the production level of dairy milk in Trinidad and Tobago is low. And a lot of the reproductive factors also here, like calving dates or reproductive data, are either lower than international levels, or with calving interval, it will be higher. So how do we measure productivity on a dairy farm? Well, productivity can be measured by the performance of the dairy herd. The reproductive efficiency variables of a herd are an especially important tool when evaluating the performance of any dairy herd. Calving interval, as mentioned before, conception rate and pregnancy rate, and days open affect the animals. A very interesting factor though, when we look at this, is that if you have one factor that's off, it'll usually negatively affect the rest of reproductive variables that you have on your farm. So you have a general decrease in your productivity. So, taking that into consideration, how can we improve the dairy industry? Well, we need to systematically evaluate and analyze the reasons for our poor fertility in our dairy cattle and even the other problems that we would face. And then by systematically doing this, we can deal with them one at a time. This project, as mentioned before, goes on to evaluate embryonic mortality. Studies have shown that embryonic losses occur for 29 to 30% of the losses after fertilization. We consider this is a large amount. So what is embryonic mortality? Basically, embryonic mortality refers to the loss of the embryo between the period of fertilization to the completion of the differentiation stage. In cattle, this is approximately at day 42. It is divided into 2 sections, the first being early embryonic mortality. This occurs before day 15 post-conception. It does not affect the length of the estrus cycle. However, to a farmer, it's significantly important because you lose the embryo, so the cow does not produce a calf. It, as mentioned before, does not lengthen the estrus cycle, so you have a normal 21-day cycle. No signs of abortions are diagnosed at this stage. With late embryonic mortality, it's a bit different. This occurs between day 16 to day 42, and the cow returns to estrus, but we see it happens at a later stage. Most of the time, when you look at your animal, the 22-day period will go on, and then the animal will come into 35 to 50 days after. So we see it lengthens the cycle length. With this one too, no signs of abortions or loss of embryo is seen. So what are the effects of embryonic mortality? Well, they result in reduced pregnancy rates, slower genetic improvement, and substantial financial losses to the farmer. This is especially important in a place like Trinidad and Tobago. Here we have smaller herds, and each animal counts to a farmer. Each conception is important. If he loses this conception, it lengthens his calving interval, and his financial gain from this animal goes down. So it's really important to correct this problem. So why do this study? Well, in Trinidad and Tobago, we usually confirm pregnancy at about day 60 to 90 post-inception. It's important to note that there are some persons who are trained and can really pick it up at an earlier stage, but confirmation is usually done at day 60 to 90. By confirming pregnancy at this time, however, it does not take into consideration losses that may have occurred during the embryonic period. So the general objective of this study was to establish whether or not dairy cattle in Trinidad do suffer from embryonic mortality. And this was done using transrectal ultrasonography, first at day 25 and then again at day 60. The specific objectives were to determine whether embryonic mortality occurrence varies between farms, whether there's variation in it occurring between cows and heifers, and whether it's affected by the type of estrus in which the animal is bred to. So the first part of carrying out this study was to select farms on which the study could be done on. When doing this, we first looked at how willing the farmer was to take part in the study. After that, we looked at if they had any open animals available. We didn't want any animals that were pregnant, and then probably due to record keeping, it could have been later on in pregnancy or early on in pregnancy. So we didn't want to have that mix-up. So we selected animals that were open. And then finally, we looked at farms that had better record keeping and better management practices on their farm. This helped us because by looking at the higher section of the spectrum where you have better management, we could look and see if embryonic mortality occurs here and at what rate. Then we could go on further and do studies on farms that had a little less better management and then compare them to see what the differences would be. So, secondly, we went on to breed the animals. Some of the animals were bred by a timed artificial insemination protocol. At day 0, we inserted a seeder which releases progesterone gradually into the animal. At day 7, it was removed and an injection of PGF2 alpha was administered. 48 hours after that, injection of estrogen was given and the animals were then bred 24 hours later. The other type of estrus that was used was, of course, natural estrus. The farmers looked at their animals and when they observed them in standing heat, they called the AI services and they came and inseminated the animals. The final step, the second to last step, was to do the ultrasounds. The ultrasounds were first done at day 25 to 30 and then day 60 post-insemination. Finally, the results were analyzed using the chi-square method to determine whether there were statistical differences on embryonic mortalities between the farms, the physiological state, and the type of estrus the animals were bred to. So the results. This is just a basic pie chart showing the distribution of the animals used in the study to the farms. You see one farm had 41 and the smallest amount of animals used on a farm was about 50. This graph shows the distribution of oestrus type. We see that 34% of the animals were bred to natural estrus, while 66% were bred to synchronized oestrus. Right. So when determining embryonic mortality, what we looked at is that at day 25 to 30, when the first ultrasound was done, we made sure that pregnancy was confirmed. So the animal, we viewed them and ensured that they were pregnant. Then again, we came back at day 60 and checked again if they were pregnant. Only if no signs of pregnancy was seen at day 60, then we used that to say, well, they may have suffered from embryonic mortality. So in my study, what happened is that 6.5% of the animals showed embryonic mortality, whereas 93.5% did not. Based on the farm location, as I said before, we used the chi-square method. The significant value for the chi-square method used was 0.05. So let me just basically explain how it works. If you have something greater than 0.05, then it's not significant. There's no relationship with the embryonic mortality on a specific farm. It could equally happen on any. So for farm location, we had a p-value of 0.357, which is greater than the significant value. So there was no real relationship between, okay, farm 1 had 3. If you look at this and you just, on a glance, you see farm 3 and then you had the occurrences of embryonic that being 3, you would think, okay, it's more likely that this farm was more prevalent. But what the statistics shows is that it could have equally happened on any farm. It wasn't just based on that location. With the OH stress type, we have the same type of results. There is no significance in whether it was happening by natural stress or synchronized stress. Based on physiological state again, same type of thing, we had a p-value of 0.984, which shows that whether it was a cow or a heifer, embryonic mortality could have happened in either. So what are our conclusions? Well, from our conclusions, we can see that embryonic mortality does occur in Trinidad and Tobago because it was evident on the farm used in the study. 4 out of 61 animals showed or were affected by embryonic mortality, which is an overall percentage of 6.5. Farm location, physiological state, and OH stress type had no effect or did not affect the embryonic mortality occurrences. So what recommendations can we make from them? Well, firstly, seeing that the study was so small, what we can do is conduct this study on a greater number of farms. As mentioned earlier, I said that we could do it on farms with worse management practices than for better use of the and we want to use a greater pool of animals. We could conduct this study to determine the occurrences of early embryonic mortality, since it was not studied in this project. We can then pinpoint the causes of embryonic mortality in Trinidad and Tobago. One of the most important factors that I think, or things that we can do, is of course educate our farmers. By educating our farmers, we are able to help them boost their productivity. And to me, studying at UTT, which advocates for helping farmers, to me that was the main thing that we could do to help our farmers. Then we could, as mentioned before, conduct the study on farms with varying degrees of management and husbandry practices. Just my acknowledgements. I'd like to thank God, my supervisors, Mr. Siwa and Dr. Stott, and the staff at all the farms that Dr. Mohammed, all the farms that were used for the study. My references, questions.